When we're working with someone and we try a new intervention, we're always hoping for that moment where things really click, where we see a genuine shift.
Absolutely, that feeling of, okay, I think we're onto something here. We all chase that.
But how do we actually know for sure that it was that intervention, that specific thing we did, that made the difference? How do we separate the signal from the noise, so to speak? That's what we're going to unpack today.
Welcome back to ABA Chapter Chat. It's great to be diving into this with you.
Always a pleasure. As always, we're here to demystify some of the core concepts of ABA.
Right, taking those sometimes complex ideas and turning them into something you can actually use day to day in your practice. Practical insights, that's what we're all about.
Exactly. And today, our focus is on figuring out with as much certainty as we can if the interventions we're using are truly effective.
Because it's one thing to see a behavior change, to see things moving in the right direction.
Right. Improvement is what we're all aiming for.
Of course. But we need to be confident as we can be, that it's our actions, the interventions we're putting in place that are driving those positive changes, not just something else happening at the same time or just random chance.
So it's not enough to just see improvement. We need to know we're the ones making it happen.
Yeah.
Okay, let's break this down a bit. Why is it so important to go beyond just observing a decrease in a behavior, for instance, and really dig into whether our intervention is what's making that happen?
It's a great question. Because on the surface, you might think, hey, the behavior is decreasing, that's what we wanted, so we're good, right?
Yeah.
But evaluating the effectiveness of an intervention is really about more than that initial change.
More than just the surface level.
Yeah. We're talking about creating lasting change, not just a temporary dip in the behavior. We need to be sure that the change we're seeing is reliable, that it's going to stick over time, and, like we were saying before, that it's really due to the intervention, not just a coincidence.
So it's about making sure those changes are solid and that we can trust they'll continue.
Exactly. And there's an ethical piece to this as well, something that's really important for us to keep in mind. We have a responsibility as ABA professionals to use interventions that have been shown to be effective.
Right. We want to be using the best tools for the job, so to speak.
Precisely. We want to be sure that we're dedicating our time and resources, and even more importantly, the individual's time and energy, to approaches that are most likely to lead to the best outcomes.
So it's about being responsible and making the most of everyone's efforts.
Absolutely. And this all ties into what we call demonstrating a functional relation.
Okay, that sounds a bit technical. What does functional relation actually mean in practice?
In simple terms, it means showing, with evidence, that the changes in behavior we're seeing are a direct result of the intervention we put in place. It's about establishing that cause and effect link.
So we can confidently say this intervention is what caused this change.
Right. We can be more certain that it's not just something else that's going on in the person's life or just a natural fluctuation in the behavior.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We want to be as sure as we can that we're making the difference. Okay, so how do we actually go about figuring out if we've established that link, that functional relation? What are the key things we need to think about when we're evaluating how well an intervention is doing?
There are three core concepts to consider: internal validity, external validity, and social validity. You can think of them as three lenses through which we examine the effectiveness of our interventions.
Okay, three lenses. I like that. Let's start with internal validity. What does that one mean?
So internal validity is all about whether we can confidently say that our intervention, and not something else, caused the change in behavior. It's about answering that fundamental question: are the changes we're seeing truly because of what we did?
So it's about making sure that our intervention is the real driving force behind the change.
Right. We want to rule out other possible explanations. Can I give you an example?
Yeah, an example would be helpful.
Imagine we're working with a student who has difficulty transitioning between activities. They often get upset or disruptive during those times.
Okay, that's a pretty common challenge.
It is. So we decide to introduce a visual schedule to help the student anticipate and prepare for those transitions, and we start to see a decrease in their disruptive behavior.
That's great. Sounds like the visual schedule is working.
That's what we'd hope, right? But here's where internal validity comes in. What if, around the same time we introduced the visual schedule, there was also a significant change in the student's home environment? Maybe there was a lot of stress at home that is now resolved. or they started a new medication.
Ah, I see. So now it becomes more difficult to say for sure whether it was the visual schedule that made the difference or if those other factors played a role.
Exactly. It could be the visual schedule, it could be those other factors, or it could be a combination. Our confidence that the visual schedule alone was responsible is a bit lower now because there are other plausible explanations. We'd say the internal validity of our intervention is weaker in this case.
So it's about being aware of other things that might be influencing the behavior and trying to isolate the effect of our intervention as much as possible.
Okay, that makes sense. What about external validity? How does that fit into the picture?
External validity is about how much we can generalize the findings from a particular study, or even from our work with one individual to other people, other settings, or even other but similar behaviors. It's about asking, if this worked in this one situation, can we expect it to work in other situations as well?
So if we find a really effective social skills training program that works well for one teenager with autism in a small group therapy setting, external validity would be about whether we could expect that same program to be just as effective for a different teenager with autism, maybe in their high school classroom or in a workplace setting.
A perfect example. And there are so many factors that can influence whether those positive outcomes will generalize to a new situation. The characteristics of the individuals involved, the specific details of the environment, even the way the intervention is implemented can all play a role. So something that works beautifully in a quiet, controlled clinic setting might not work as well in a busy and unpredictable school environment, for instance.
Exactly. There's a lot to consider when we're thinking about external validity. And that brings us to our third lens, social validity.
Right, you mentioned that one earlier, and you said it was really important.
It's crucial. Social validity is about whether the goals we're targeting, the procedures we're using, and the outcomes we're achieving are acceptable and meaningful to the individual we're working with, their family, and other stakeholders. It's about making sure that what we're doing is not just effective from a data standpoint, but that it also aligns with the values and priorities of the people involved.
So even if we have an intervention that's technically very effective at changing a behavior, if the person receiving it or their family find it to be unpleasant or intrusive, or if they don't see the targeted behavior as something that truly impacts their quality of life, then that intervention is lacking in social validity.
Exactly. You can have an intervention that looks great on paper with all the data showing a clear change. But if the person feels demeaned by the process, or if the behavior we're targeting isn't actually important to them or their family, then it's not a truly successful intervention.
So it's not just about the numbers, it's about the human impact and whether the changes are meaningful and acceptable to everyone involved.
Absolutely. For an intervention to be truly effective and to be embraced by the people it's meant to help, it needs to be both effective in a technical sense and socially valid. Okay, now, you mentioned research designs earlier. In ABA, we often work very closely with individual clients. So how do these research designs fit into that one-on-one context?
Right. We're not usually dealing with large groups of people in research studies.
That's where single-subject research designs come in. These designs are specifically designed to help us systematically evaluate the effects of an intervention on a single person over time.
So instead of comparing the outcomes of different groups of people, we're looking at how an individual's behavior changes under different conditions within the intervention.
Exactly. We're basically comparing the individual to themselves across different phases of the intervention. And there are several single-subject designs that are commonly used in ABA practice.
Can you walk us through some of those designs?
Absolutely. One of the most basic and well-known designs is the withdrawal design, often called the ABA design.
ABA. Let's break that down. What do those letters represent?
So the first A refers to the baseline phase. This is where we collect data on the behavior we're targeting before we introduce any intervention. We're just observing the behavior as it naturally occurs.
Okay, so we're getting a sense of the starting point.
Right. Then the first B phase is where we introduce our intervention. We implement whatever strategy or approach we've chosen, and we continue to collect data on the behavior.
So we're looking to see if there's a change in the behavior once the intervention is in place.
Exactly. Now here's where the withdrawal part comes in. The second A phase is when we temporarily withdraw the intervention. We stop doing the intervention, and we continue to monitor the behavior.
And the purpose of withdrawing the intervention is to see if the behavior reverts back to what it was like during the baseline.
You got it. If the behavior improves during the first B phase when the intervention is in place, and then it worsens again when we remove the intervention in the second A phase, that gives us a stronger indication that the intervention is what's causing the change.
It makes sense. If the behavior goes back to how it was before we intervened, it suggests that the intervention was having an effect.
Right. And then to further solidify that link, we reintroduce the intervention in the final B phase. If the behavior improves again, it gives us even more confidence that the intervention is responsible for the change.
So it's like we're turning the intervention on and off and seeing how the behavior responds.
Exactly. That's why it's called a withdrawal design. Now, of course, there are ethical considerations to keep in mind when using withdrawal design.
Right. We wouldn't want to remove an intervention that's clearly helping someone just to prove a point.
Exactly. And there are also times when a behavior, once it's changed, might not fully revert back to baseline levels even when we withdraw the intervention. That can sometimes make it harder to interpret the data.
So there are some limitations and things to be cautious about.
There are with any design. But the ABAB design is a powerful tool for demonstrating a functional relationship between an intervention and a behavior change.
Okay, so that's the ABAB design. What other designs might we use in practice?
Another one that's very helpful is the changing criterion design. In this design, we gradually change the criterion or goal for the behavior we're targeting, and we provide reinforcement based on the individual meeting that changing criterion.
Can you give an example to make that a bit clearer?
Sure. Let's say we're working with a student who has difficulty staying focused on their work. They often get up and wander around the classroom. So we might start by setting a goal of having them stay seated for 5 minutes at a time. Once they're consistently meeting that goal, we might increase it to 7 minutes, then 10 minutes, and so on.
So we're gradually increasing the expectation, and each time they meet the new expectation, we reinforce that behavior.
Exactly. And if we see that the student's behavior is consistently adjusting to meet those new criteria, it shows that our intervention is effectively shaping their behavior.
So it's like we're slowly raising the bar, and the student is rising to the occasion.
Exactly. It's a great way to shape new behaviors or to gradually increase or decrease rates of existing behaviors. But it's important to make sure that the behavior is something that can change in small increments, and we need to be careful not to change the criterion too quickly.
So we need to find that sweet spot where the changes are challenging but achievable.
Right. If we make the changes too big or too fast, the student might get discouraged or frustrated, and we won't see that clear pattern of improvement.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've talked about withdrawal designs and changing criterion designs. What are some other options?
Another really powerful design is the multiple baseline design. This design is particularly useful when we can't or shouldn't withdraw an intervention for ethical or practical reasons.
So it's an alternative when those other designs aren't a good fit.
Exactly. And the basic idea behind the multiple baseline design is that we implement the same intervention across different behaviors for the same individual, across different settings for the same behavior, or across different individuals for the same behavior, but we stagger the start times for each baseline.
Okay, that sounds a bit complicated. Can you break that down with an example?
Sure. Let's say we're working with a child who has difficulty with transitions. They have trouble transitioning from playtime to mealtime to bath time, and from bath time to bedtime. Each of those transitions is a struggle.
Got it. 3 different transitions, all problematic.
Right. So we decide to use a visual timer to help the child understand how much time is left before the transition. But instead of introducing the timer for all 3 transitions at once, we might start with just the playtime to mealtime transition. We'll use the timer for that transition and collect data on how well it's working.
Okay, so we're focusing on one transition at a time.
Exactly. Then, after a week or two, once we've seen some improvement with that first transition, we introduce the timer for the mealtime to bath time transition while continuing to use it for the playtime to mealtime transition. And then finally, we introduce the timer for the bath time to bedtime transition.
So we're basically rolling out the intervention in stages, one transition at a time.
Right. And the key here is that we're looking for a pattern. If we see that the child's behavior improves for each transition only after we introduce the timer for that specific transition, then that gives us strong evidence that the timer is what's making the difference, not just some other factor.
So it's about showing that the change is linked to the timing of the intervention, even though we're not withdrawing it completely.
Exactly. And the advantage of this design is that we don't have to worry about the ethical concerns of withdrawing an intervention that might be working.
That's a big plus. But you mentioned that we have to stagger the start times. Why is that so important?
It's crucial because if we introduced the intervention for all three transitions at the same time, we wouldn't be able to isolate its effect. We wouldn't know if any improvement we saw was due to the timer or to something else that happened to change around the same time for all three transitions.
So the staggered start times allow us to tease apart the effect of the intervention from other potential influences.
Precisely. Now, the multiple baseline design does require some careful planning. We need to choose baselines, whether they're behaviors, settings, or individuals, that are relatively independent of each other.
What do you mean by independent?
We want to be sure that changes in one baseline aren't likely to spill over and influence the other baselines. So in our example with the transitions, if the child's difficulty transitioning from playtime to mealtime was directly related to their difficulty transitioning from mealtime to bath time, then those wouldn't be ideal baselines to use together.
Because if we saw improvement in both of those transitions after introducing the timer for just one of them, we wouldn't know if the timer was the reason or if the improvement in one transition naturally led to improvement in the other.
Exactly. So we need to be thoughtful about how we choose our baselines to make sure we can isolate the effect of the intervention.
Okay, that makes sense. What about other designs? Are there any others that are commonly used in ABA?
Another one you might find useful is the alternating treatments design, sometimes called a multi-element design. This design allows us to compare the effectiveness of two or more different interventions for the same behavior relatively quickly.
So we're basically putting different interventions head-to-head to see which one works better.
Exactly. The different interventions are alternated, often within the same session or across consecutive sessions, and we collect data on the behavior under each intervention condition.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's imagine we're working with a student who has difficulty completing math worksheets independently. We might be considering two different prompting strategies to help them. One that involves verbal prompts, where we tell them what to do, and another that involves visual prompts, where we use pictures or diagrams to guide them.
Okay, two different approaches to prompting.
Right. So in an alternating treatments design, we might use the verbal prompts for one worksheet, then the visual prompts for the next worksheet, then back to verbal prompts, and so on. And we keep track of how many problems the student completes correctly under each prompting condition.
So we're switching back and forth between the interventions and seeing which one leads to better performance.
Exactly. This allows us to get a pretty quick sense of which intervention might be more effective for that individual. It's like a mini experiment within our regular practice.
That's a really efficient way to compare different approaches. But wouldn't switching back and forth between interventions be confusing for the student?
That's definitely something to consider. For this design to work well, it's important that the different interventions are clearly distinct from each other so that the student can easily tell which one is being used at any given time.
So if the interventions are too similar, it might be hard to separate their effects.
Exactly. And there's also the possibility of what we call multiple treatment interference.
What does that mean?
It means that the effects of one intervention might carry over and influence how the student responds to the next intervention. So we need to be aware of that possibility and interpret our data carefully.
So it's a powerful tool, but we need to use it with some caution and thoughtfulness.
Right. Every research design has its own set of strengths and limitations.
Mm.
And then there's the multiple probe design, which is a variation of the multiple baseline design.
Oh, right. You mentioned that one earlier. How is it different from the multiple baseline?
In a multiple probe design, instead of continuously collecting data on all the baselines, we only collect data intermittently using what we call probes. So we might collect data on all the baselines initially to establish those baseline levels, and then we only collect data again right before we introduce the intervention for each baseline.
So it's a way to be more efficient with our data collection.
Exactly. And it's especially helpful when continuous data collection would be disruptive or too time-consuming. Now, all of these designs we've talked about are great for helping us determine if an intervention as a whole is effective. But what if we have a more complex intervention with multiple components? How do we figure out which parts of the intervention are the ones that are actually responsible for the change?
That's a really interesting question. I can imagine that could get tricky.
It can. That's where something called component analysis comes in. It's a way to break down a complex intervention into its individual components and then test those components systematically to see which ones are essential for the behavior change.
So it's like we're trying to isolate the active ingredients within the intervention package.
Exactly. And that can be really helpful for making our interventions more efficient and targeted. We might find that some components are unnecessary, or that certain combinations of components work better than others.
So it's about getting a more nuanced understanding of what's driving the change.
Exactly. Now, another important aspect of evaluating interventions is figuring out the optimal amount or intensity of the intervention.
Right. It's not just about whether an intervention works, but also about how much of it we need to use to get the best results.
Exactly. That's where something called parametric analysis comes in. Parametric analysis is about systematically examining different levels or intensities of an intervention to see which level produces the best outcomes.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's say we're using positive reinforcement to increase a desired behavior. We might want to know whether reinforcing the behavior every single time it occurs is more effective than reinforcing it every other time, or maybe every 5 times.
So we're tweaking the frequency of reinforcement to see what works best.
Exactly. And that can help us fine-tune our interventions and make sure we're using them in the most effective way possible.
All of this is incredibly helpful for understanding whether an intervention is working from a data standpoint. But as you mentioned earlier, it's not just about the data, it's also about the human impact. So how do we determine if the change we're seeing is truly meaningful in the person's everyday life?
That brings us back to that crucial concept of social validity. As ABA professionals, we need to remember that our ultimate goal is to improve the quality of life for the individuals we work with. And that means making sure that the changes we're making are meaningful and valuable to them and their families.
So it's not just about reducing a behavior on a graph, it's about whether that reduction actually translates into a positive difference in the person's life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's also about making sure that the interventions we're using are acceptable to the people involved. Even if an intervention is technically very effective, if it causes distress or discomfort, or if it conflicts with the person's or their family's values, it's not a good intervention.
So social validity is about balancing the effectiveness of an intervention with its ethical and social implications.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot where we're making a real difference in people's lives in a way that's respectful and meaningful to them.
Now, thinking about the realities of practice, what are some of the challenges that ABA professionals might face when trying to use these systematic methods to evaluate their interventions?
There are definitely some real-world challenges. One of the biggest is simply time. ABA professionals are often working in busy settings with multiple clients and competing demands. Finding the time to carefully design and implement these research designs can be difficult.
It's a lot to juggle.
It is. And then there's the challenge of resources. We might not always have access to the materials or support we need to implement certain designs or collect data in the way we'd ideally like to.
So it's about being creative and finding ways to work within the constraints of our settings.
Exactly. And as we talked about earlier, there are also ethical considerations. Especially when we're talking about designs that involve withdrawing interventions, we need to be very thoughtful about the potential risks and benefits.
We don't want to cause harm in the process of trying to prove a point.
Absolutely. And finally, there's the challenge of involving stakeholders in the evaluation process.
Right, we talked about the importance of social validity.
Exactly. It's essential to get input from the individuals we're working with and their families throughout the process, from choosing the goals to evaluating the outcomes. But that can be challenging logistically and communication-wise.
So it's about finding ways to collaborate effectively and make sure everyone's voices are heard. Okay, so to recap what we've covered today, we've talked about the importance of evaluating the effectiveness of our ABA interventions, and we've explored 3 key concepts: internal validity, external validity, and social validity. We've also delved into several different single-subject research designs that ABA professionals can use in their practice.
Those designs give us a framework for systematically evaluating whether our interventions are truly making a difference.
And we've emphasized that it's not just about the data. It's about making sure that the changes we're seeing are meaningful and acceptable to the people we're working with and their families.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, it's about improving lives in a way that's ethical, respectful, and sustainable.
So for our listeners who are leaving this deep dive, what's one concrete action they can take? What's a small step they can implement to start thinking more critically about the effectiveness of their interventions?
I'd encourage everyone to take a closer look at the data they're currently collecting. Are you simply tracking the occurrence or non-occurrence of a behavior? Or are you structuring your data collection in a way that allows you to systematically evaluate the impact of a specific intervention? Even small tweaks to how you collect data can make a big difference.
So being more intentional and purposeful with our data collection.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to experiment a little. Try incorporating a baseline phase before you start an intervention. Or try tracking a behavior across different settings to see if the intervention is having a consistent effect.
So it's about finding ways to be more data-driven, even within the constraints of our busy practices.
Precisely. And there are lots of great resources out there to help you learn more about single-subject research designs and data analysis.
All right, there's always more to learn and explore.
Absolutely. And ultimately, that commitment to understanding what works and why is what drives our field forward.
It's what allows us to continue to refine our practices and achieve the best possible outcomes for the individuals we serve.
And to do it in a way that honors their values and priorities and makes a genuine difference in their lives.
So it's a journey of continuous learning and improvement, always striving to do better for the people we support. Thanks so much for sharing your insights with us today. It's been a really enlightening conversation.
You too. It's been a pleasure diving into this topic with you.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it helpful.
Until next time, keep those questions coming and keep striving to make a positive impact.
We'll see you then.